Well, welcome back to The Right Hook. This time with me, Patrick Geoghegan. Tonight I get to fulfil a lifetime ambition in presenting The Right Hook, joining such illustrious historians as Richard Aldous and Diarmuid Ferriter. I'm taking over for the final half hour of tonight's show because we are talking about the essential songs from the 20th century, and my special guest tonight, well, he's a little bit nervous, he's a little bit shy, he needs some special coaxing because he's not used to being on the radio, and so they asked me to stand in for George. My special guest tonight, his name, well, it's also George. It's George Hook. And George, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Patrick.
So, essential.
This is a lifetime ambition too, I can tell you, to present an essential song from the 20th century.
You must be very disappointed with all the guests you've had on the slot. You've thought, I have to do this myself. There's a song they're missing out on. So George, what song have you picked?
Well, I think it's an extraordinary song. We're talking about 20th century here, and I used to champ at the bit as some of my guests thought 20th century started, in sort of 1970. This was written in 1915 or thereabouts, and it became very much a song of the Germans in the trenches. Now, at this point, it was called The Girl Under the Lantern, and it was recorded in 1939 or so by Lili Anderson, and it became a huge song for the German troops in World War II. It amazingly was taken up by the British, particularly in North Africa, Rommel on one side, Montgomery on the other, and suddenly you had this song being taken up by both sides because it was written also in English then by a fellow called Cooper. But the version I want to talk about of Lili Marlene is, of course, the wonderful Marlene Dietrich, who of herself was an extraordinary woman in the context of World War II.
So that's quite extraordinary that a song would be popular during the Second World War with both the Allies and the Axis soldiers. So in a way, this became an anthem for both sides.
Yeah, you see, it was so good. Apparently what happened was when the Germans invaded Yugoslavia and took over Belgrade, they used Radio Belgrade and they actually christened it, German Soldiers Radio. And they were stuck for things to play. And somebody found this record, in a dust-covered corner somewhere. They played it, and it had only sold about 500 copies, and suddenly but this is the Lili Anderson version, of course, because they're playing German, because Dietrich is a traitor by German standards, which has gone to America, and then it was immediately taken up by German soldiers. Goebbels, in fact, didn't like it at all. He wanted to ban it, but all the German soldiers kept writing in and saying, we want to hear it, we want to hear it. So then the British, and particularly North Africa, because, there was no fighting in Europe, you see, at this point, as you well know, Patrick, because the Germans control Europe. So the battles are being fought in different theatres, and the North African campaign is where the British picked it up. Now, the interesting thing about Dietrich, she's fantastic. Berliner. She basically leaves Germany, she sees the rise of Nazism. She goes to America, becomes a wonderful film star. There is one of the most erotic movies of all time, Patrick. I know you love erotic movies, but Dietrich, it's called The Blue Angel, and it's the story of this sort of siren of a woman who leads a wealthy man to degradation and poverty, and she sings in that, and she's wonderful. But the Nazis tried to lure her back because it would have been a coup for them. She wouldn't go. She took American citizenship. And immediately the war went to Europe, she was straight on a plane, because so many celebrities went for the troops. And she went all the way into Germany with two generals, my pal, George Patton, and Jumping Jimmy Gavin of the Airborne. And she was literally just a few miles from the German lines, Patrick. And if they'd picked her up, I wouldn't like to have been in her shoes.
So it's kind of her version then that's the one that made it iconic. That's the one that people really remember.
Well, it does for me, I think. Dietrich was voted, I think, the 9th most famous female film star of all time. And she actually, her success, funny enough, was more as a kind of a theatre singer. You know, she actually sang in the Savoy when she was about 80 in Middle Abbey Street. And the place was packed.
Were you at it?
Yeah, of course I was. This is about the 1960s. And she lived until she was 90. I'd like to play it, Patrick, because it's in German. And what they did was, amazingly, they used it as propaganda and they played it back to the German troops. The Americans did to sort of, propaganda. So why don't we roll it, Colette?
Vor der Kaserne, vor dem großen Tor, steht eine Laterne und steht sie noch davor. Dort wollen wir uns wiedersehen, bei der Laterne wollen wir stehen, wie einst Lili Marlene, wie einst Lili Marlene. Unsere beiden Schatten sahen wie ein aus, dass wir lieb uns hatten, das sah man gleich daraus. Und alle Leute sollen es sehen, wenn wir bei der Laterne stehen, wie einst Lili Marlene.
Cooper's English words are underneath the lamplight, by the barrack gate, Lili Marlene, my own Lili Marlene. And I think she like such a wonderful husky voice. She gives it a great sense. And I think the thing about that, try and put it in some kind of perspective. You know, you can imagine a German soldier in a foxhole at Stalingrad or something, you know, or a British soldier with sand and flies in his tea on the Western Desert, and they're listening to that.
Well, that's why I can understand why Goebbels wanted to ban it, because even listening to that, you know, the version in German, it's haunting, it's very sorrowful about loss. It's not a propaganda song that Goebbels would have approved of.
No, you see, that's the thing. And Dietrich's sister had remained in Germany, and she lived in the village or town of Belsen, where the famous concentration camp was. And the camp guards used to eat in her restaurant or stay in her hotel. And after the war, there was a real possibility that her and her husband might have been in trouble as collaborators. And Dietrich interceded on her sister's behalf, and her sister was in fact never charged. That is, her later life was sad because she was kind of estranged from her daughter. She was reputedly sexually ambivalent, although she was married for a long time. She had wonderful legs, Patrick. Even in the Savoy, at 80 years of age, I'm sitting there and she had great pins.
And lots of reputed lovers, including John F. Kennedy, who you were talking about earlier.
Well, she was born in 1901, so Kennedy would have been around, presumably, at when she was 60. And he would have been, in his late 30s maybe, or just 40. So that was some performance by her, I would have thought.
Well, she was still turning your eye at the age of 80. So.
Yeah, she was.
And Kennedy was... Kennedy, we know what he was like.
Yeah.
Did other people do versions of the song?
Well, the amazing one, I think, which people listening will be amazed by, was Connie Francis. Now, when you think Connie had a hit with Lipstick on Your Collar, it's surprising. But she did a German version of it. Connie Francis did. And then there was another one later on I'm not familiar with. I've never heard heard by somebody called Amanda Lear. I know nothing about that. I haven't actually, and I probably should have in my research, but if I had listened to Connie Francis singing this, I think it would have ruined the Dietrich version forever.
Jerry in Limerick has texted in on 53106 to say that as a wartime baby, his mother used to sing this song to him a lot, and he clearly still remembers that. Someone else texted in to say that she was a wisdom of beauty secrets, according to Shirley MacLaine. Shirley MacLaine. So that was another thing she had.
Yeah, she was a bit like another famous, iconic film star of an earlier period, Greta Garbo. She lived in Paris towards the end, but Garbo and herself did. Once I think they lost, or believed they lost their sexual attraction, they became recluses, really. And the fact that she didn't really get on with her daughter, I think, was very sad. You know?
So what makes it one of the essential songs of the 20th century then? Is it the fact that it's this haunting war song that united both sides in the conflict?
I think that it two wars, World War One and World War Two, troops relate to this. The fact that it becomes, astonishingly, in World War II, an anthem for two sides who are so opposed culturally, historically, and everything. When you think the Allies would have viewed the Germans as the Antichrist of Europe at that time, with the Holocaust and the appalling atrocities on the Eastern Front. And this song, I think it's amazing. I don't know any other song that achieved that over, what was a 30, 40-year period. Extraordinary. Sung by, in different languages, sung by different women, but Dietrich remains because she was Dietrich, you know. Interestingly, her film career is patchy. She was with a director called Joseph von Sternberg, a German director, who many people feel sort of made her. But if you watch her movies like Shanghai Express and those, I loved her late in her career. Judgment at Nuremberg, and she was in that, and I really loved her in that. And
she was in an Orson Welles movie as well.
She was. I'm trying to remember the name of that one.
Yeah, she was the haunting. I think it's the Touch of Evil. She makes, yes, and she's great in that. She's
Touch of Evil,
in
which is on the Mexican border, and Janet Leigh is in it. And
Charlton Heston as a Mexican cop.
But if you want to see her, for me, at her absolute best, with the wonderful James Stewart in
Destry Rides Again.
Destry Rides Again. See what the boys in the back room will have. Do you remember that?
I do. It's one of those classic westerns, and it's amazing that I can see, though, why it moved people so much during the war, that if you were a soldier, if you were an infantryman, if even you were one of the commanders like Rommel who loved it, I can see why, because you're fighting every day, but then at night time you can listen to this very haunting piece of music and you can
kind of imagine your sweetheart standing under the lantern by the barrack gate, waiting for you to come out. I think you could fantasize, that I'm going to be at home and wife or girlfriend's waiting for me. I think the fellow who wrote it probably didn't think of it, but it struck an incredible chord. I think it is, there will be hundreds of essential songs of the 20th century. I think this is right up there in the top 10.
Dave says that he completely agrees with George about Lili Marlene. He says that John Steinbeck wrote a wonderful piece on the song, and you have to look up a piece called Once There Was a War. You'll love it. So thanks for that, Dave. That's something George will have to follow up. John Steinbeck. So it's clearly a song that has influenced people, that has moved people for over 50 years.
Yeah. I think what makes it most extraordinary is that the German version, although Cooper, who wrote the British words to it, and were recorded by Lali Anderson, I think it is extraordinary when all things German would have been, verboten, to use a German phrase, in Britain, that it would have been part and would have been listened to, not just by troops, because eventually, of course, the people on the home front listened and sang it.
Gary in Mount Bala says that it's a great song and she was a very sexy lady, but not as sexy as George and Dana singing Goodness Gracious Me. I'm not familiar with you and Dana singing that. I thought I knew all your YouTube highlight reel.
Well, you've got to go on iTunes and download duets for Dana and I and Goodness Gracious Me, which is a reprise of Peter Sellers and Sophia Loren.
Very good. Okay. So this is one of the essential songs of the 20th century. I said 50 years, it's probably more 100 years. We're approaching the centenary of it being written. Will it still move a younger audience?
No, I don't think so, because for the vast proportion now of two generations, they have avoided real warfare. Yeah, I mean, we have seen...
Thankfully.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, we have seen local conflicts, because Vietnam or Korea or Kosovo or whatever are still essentially local conflicts. There isn't that sense of German troops outside Stalingrad, British troops outside Benghazi, and they're all brought together by this song. I mean, thankfully, as you say, it doesn't happen, but I think you had to have a certain set of circumstances to make this song as iconic as it was.
Well, George, I'm afraid the producer is in my ear. I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening.